We are going to start the panel now.
No, here. Yeah, that's good.
Good afternoon, and I hope you all had enjoyed the lunch. Thank you. Okay, let's start the second panel. Let me. I'm sorry, So now we will have the second panel session of the 4th Geneva Forum, Panel 2, Cultural Genocide in Tibet. For the panel, we are honored to have our chairperson, Representative Sonam Frasila, Office of Tibet, London, and the panelist, Dr. Tenzin Desel, Senior Research Fellow, Tibet Policy Institute, and Dr. Martin Mills, Director, Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research and Senior Lecturer in Anthropology, and then Pierre-Antoine Donnet, French journalist, former agent France correspondent in Beijing and former editor at French Dex Paris, and Vijay Grandiji, senior journalist and photographer, specializes in Tibet and China. May I kindly invite the chairperson and the panelists on the podium, on the dais. With this, now I will hand over the stage to Chairperson, Representative Sonam Frasila. Over to you.
Good afternoon, conference. We're sorry we are a few minutes late, and I'll try to save these few minutes by not giving or reading the full biography of all our panelists here, because the organizers have done a marvelous job in... Oh, sorry. Good afternoon. We're slightly running late, probably a few minutes, and to save time, I'm not going to read the biography of all the panels in order to save time. Also, since this is such an important subject, I want to make sure that we allocate the time as economically as possible, and my first request to all the speakers on this panel is please try to keep your presentation to 15 minutes as much as possible, so that we will have more time for interactions after the panel's presentation. I want to start by saying cultural genocide in Tibet. Of course, in 1960s, the international jurist for they found that there was, in fact, cultural genocide which took place in Tibet. Now is more important why we need to discuss this further by looking at what has happened to Uyghurs and the international stance on genocide. So it is a great impetus for us to make sure we deal with this subject very thoroughly. One of the remarks that I want to make before we start is, I find the general people's opinion on China is that it is such a rich and has such a variety of cultural heritage. But as much as I would like to agree, it has always dawned on me that China has not, the communist China has not developed the cultural heritage of China. Mao Zedong has systematically disbanded or destroyed what they had, and the route they have taken for all other nationals, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, have been same and throughout. So, to discuss all this important subject, I want to ask Dr. Tenzin Tasel. He is the current Senior Research Fellow of the Tibet Policy Institute, researching on development in Tibet and ethnic policy in China. He has told me that he will start this conversation in 3 stages. First, he wants to bring forward the cultural genocide publication that the Institute has done. Secondly, he is going to look at this, how the cultural genocide took place or can be linked with the landmarks theorization of genocide compared to Nazis. And thirdly, he wants to discuss this genocide in the context of the 70,000 words of petition by the 10th Dalai Lama. So I would like to ask Tenzin Tasela to discuss the subject, please.
So I hope I'm audible. Right. First of all, I wanted to thank the organizers for graciously extending the invitation for me to come to Geneva and speak on this wonderful and enormous gathering of scholars, practitioners, and people who are engaged in making changes in the world and perhaps by extension within China. So I thank the organizers and I thank the chair for your gracious introduction. So when I was extended the invitation, I thought about how do I go about presenting this huge topic. So I thought, initially, I thought I can just divide my presentation into 3 sections. So, so this is going to be the layout of my presentation. So first, what I'm going to do is to present to you with the key arguments which were there in a 2017 publication of the Tibet Policy Institute, which was regarding the cultural genocide in Tibet. And then second, I wanted to discuss about what are the changes taking place in contemporary Tibet. And I wanted to propose certain ideas that might be relevant in thinking through about the real situation inside Tibet. And then finally, I thought we can discuss certain issues related to erasure of history and the denial of history to the Tibetan people. So this is basically the layout that I'm going to be following through the course of my presentation. So to begin with, this is a publication that came out in 2017, which was published by the Tibet Policy Institute. So how the report was framed is through categorization into 2 different sections. So initially it was about the Tibetan civilization. So there was a discussion in the morning about this long history of recorded history of 2,000 years since the 8th and 7th century recorded history. And then the course of history and the assimilation of Buddhism into Tibet. So this is basically an introduction to Tibetan society, Tibetan history, and then how it changed with the imposition of, with the advent of the People's Republic of China and its expansionist policies in Tibet and elsewhere. So the documentation, when I started rereading the document, I realized that there are certain issues that has to be discussed and further extended. The arguments had to be further refined. So this is what I wanted to do with the rest of the presentation. So of course we were discussing about genocide since morning, so I'm sure to give you a brief introduction about what genocide is. Genocide is of course a Greek word meaning genos, the genus as we understand in botany and in zoology about genus or tribe or group, and then side, as we all know, is to eradicate. So there's a wonderful, when I was giving a presentation regarding this book a few years ago, one of the translations that I've come across was deeply fascinating to me in Tibetan. So the Tibetan translation of genocide in Tibetan was introduced to me as Zhangsel. That would be, in a sense, would be clean erasure. So I was, what I'm going to discuss about in this presentation is to think and present to you about certain ideas of erasure that the People's Republic of China is perpetrating in Tibet. So this is broadly the ideas that I will be discussing. So Raphael Lemkin, so he is the person, the Polish lawyer, a deeply fascinating person who was committed to introducing genocide and introducing the ideas and making the legal tools useful for prevention of genocide, genocidal events in the world. So, when he defined genocide, he defined it as a coordinated, so I'm quoting here, of course, a coordinated plan of different actions and actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the group themselves. So over here in this definition, I wanted to cling on to two particular words that I will be discussing in the presentation. That is the national groups and annihilation of the groups. So I will come back to this one in my in next slides that will come through. So when we talk about contemporary Tibet, I'm going to propose here that what China, the People's Republic of China, has done is to transform Tibet into a party society. So what do I mean by this? Of course, there's a huge literature, scholarly literature on describing the party state. So there's this one party ruling China, as we know. So there's this huge corpus of literature in it. But what is really lacking is the understanding of society, what kind of transformation is taking place in the society. So this is my prerogative, and this is going to be my discussion for this. So now, what do I mean by party society in Tibet? What the People's Republic of China has imposed on Tibet is, I'm going to discuss it through three major changes and imposition that the People's Republic of China has imposed on Tibet. So the first is the imposition of the PRC governance, as it was discussed earlier in the morning about the imposition of the 17-point agreement. And the other thing that we all know, living in democratic countries, I was born in India, we all know about the civil society and the relevance of civil society in pushing forward policies and making amends to this generating space for politics, so to speak. So what is really happening in China is civil society is actually used as a tool for political governance. So this is not my research, so this is a research done by somebody else called Sutton Mattingly, who has actually quite convincingly proved that in People's Republic of China, civil society is actually used as a tool for political control. So I'm going to give you another example in Tibet. So for instance, in 2018, so there was this notice served called Notice of the Tibet Autonomous Region Public Security Department on reporting leads to crime and violation of underworld forces. So what this is trying to say is that any underworld forces, so it could be any organization, any social groups, they are targeted and they have been criminalized. So any grouping, so Human Rights Watch have recently documented about this particular monastery in Dingri, where they had contacts with Tibetans in Nepal who were engaged in an effort for post-earthquake relief. They had been criminalized too. So the criminalization of civil society formation is one of the aspects of how the party society is being formed. And another one, of course, we know about, so there are studies, Franz Michael, he is one of the examples of anthropologists who is actually working in Tibet, in the Himalayas, trying to understand the society, the Tibetan society, what he has described in his book, Rule by Incarnation. Now that understanding of Tibetan society has been completely transformed with the imposition of party leadership in Tibetan monasteries. So there's this formation of management committees, so-called management committees, in all the major monasteries, perhaps in all the monasteries, where the party leadership has to codify, regulate pretty much everything that goes around in a monastery. So that is another aspect of how Tibet is transformed into a party society. Now, when I was discussing the imposition of PRC governance, I think there are two important aspects that I wanted to discuss. Is the reimagining of Tibetan territory. So Tibetan territory, so this is one of the presentations that I've been thinking about, and perhaps I will write about this in future, is to really think about cartography innovation that the People's Republic of China has imposed on Tibet. So the Tibetan national geobody has been spliced into different provinces and incorporated into Chinese provinces. So this is one of the ways through which the PRC's governance is imposed. And another aspect that is deeply fascinating is the way by which the Tibetans are minoritized. So what do I mean by minoritized? So Tibetan people are considered to be one of the six so-called ethnic people in the People's Republic of China. So this is a process of deeply political significance for the People's Republic of China, where they have minoritized different people in the People's Republic of China, Tibetans being one of them, and the Uyghurs, and the list goes on till about 56 of them. Now, when I was discussing about erasure, one of the things that has deep resonance for me was really trying to document what is really happening in Tibet and what's happened in Tibet. So this is one of my publications where I was discussing about the relevance of history, memory that was recorded in the 70,000 character petition. So now what I'm really interested to is, of course, there were a lot of discussion about the 11th Panchen Lama. There's going to be a next session where we are going to be discussing about the 11th Panchen Lama. But with the 10th Panchen Lama, the previous Panchen Lama, he was an extraordinary figure. And in 1950s and in early 1960s, he traveled across Tibet and in many other so-called minority regions where he was documenting atrocities and many other misdeeds, so to speak, of the leadership in those regions. So this document, he compiled those documents and then he submitted it to the PRC leadership. And apparently Mao Zedong is believed to have said that this is a poisoned arrow shot at the party's leadership. Now, since 1960 till 1997, we do not know anything about this document. So this entire archive of suppression has been denied to the Tibetan people. So this history has been denied to the Tibetan people. So this is the archive of suppression. And in 1997, somehow this document made its way to the Office of Tibet Information Network in London. And then we have our office in Dharamsala, they have translated this one into Tibetan. So what I'm trying to illustrate by this is an example how to read this document as a historical text as a historical text, this oppression has been denied. So this history has been denied to the Tibetan people. And it wasn't until 1997, since 1962, when the document was submitted. All these years have elapsed, and we have no record, no substantial recording, or we do not have clear understanding of how this documentation has been reached and what are the contents of this document. So this is a form of historical denial, an erasure of history that I am interested in discussing. Now, so when I was discussing about the erasure, it was until 1995, Jasper Baker's popular history book called Hungry Ghosts, where he was documenting the atrocities committed during the Great Leap Forward in China. So he has documented, and there's an interview with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which really catches the essence of what I'm trying to say here. When we heard, I'm quoting here, when we heard that there was a large-scale famine, it was a new thing. In Tibet, food supplies had been sufficient for centuries. Agriculture was old-fashioned but sufficient. In the past, one or two individuals may have died from starvation. That is possible, otherwise it was unheard of. So this is a sort of history that has been denied. And now, it was in 2012 when the provincial government, they were doing some construction work and they were digging around, and they found unmarked graves. This is a picture taken in Yushu, so this is, right now it is incorporated into the Qinghai province. So they have found mass graves, and makes you wonder how many unmarked graves are there peppered around the Tibetan territory. So this is just one of the instances where this is documented, where we have found unmarked graves of Tibetans. So this is certainly a mass grave. So there are discussions about this one. The provincial documents, somehow the military gazetteer somehow was made available, but we have scattering of information about the atrocities committed by the People's Republic of China in those early years. But they are still very minute, and one of the publications this is just one such example. So this is written by Tenzin Pema, who was a former minister in Dharamsala. And this is a documentation done recently. I think I've heard that there's going to be an English translation of this work which is going to come up hopefully in a few months' time. So basically they have combed through archives of Sichuan province, and they have documented, so far they have documented so many Tibetans who have actually been at the receiving end of PRC's violence. And another way of actually, we as a researcher is trying to look at what is going to happen, and the method for trying to understand what is happening in Tibet is extremely difficult. As you all know, information gathering in Tibet is extremely difficult. But another way through which we could do this is through reading official documents against their grain. This is one of the ways through which we can try to understand some of this. And another way is through trying to understand the violence committed against Tibetans is through the census reports. So this is a picture of census report data collected 1982 census. And if you look at the red dot, which is peppering across Tibetan regions, so this is the skewed sex ratio of the Tibetan people. They are a lot less Tibetan men compared to Tibetan women. Of course, men during those initial years was at the forefront of violence. So they're basically the front line. So this is one sort of reflection of this kind of violence that has happened. Now, to conclude with, I'm just going to come to the conclusion and offer you some concluding thoughts. So initially when I was starting the presentation, I discussed about national groups. So, of course, there's a huge literature on what nation is, and there still continues to be many literature. So you can think of Benedict Anderson, you can think of Partha Chatterjee, and the list goes on and on. But one particular thing that, one particular quote that has really remained with me was a speech given by Ernst Renan in Sorbonne in Paris, where he was discussing about what is the nation. He was discussing about the question of what is nation. And he says that nation is a daily plebiscite. It is a daily referendum. And what I'm really thinking about is that, is China really failing at the daily plebiscite that Tibetans are actually posing every single day? And another way through which, now that the Tibetan community in exile have been scattered to different parts of the world, I have elsewhere described it as archipelagic diasporic communities in different parts of the world. And one of the ways through which the Tibetan communities can actually hold on and then continue to have this daily plebiscite questioning China's legitimacy to rule over Tibet is to actually have those memories transmitted to the next generation. If we do not have the memories, if we do not have the history, if we fail to transmit the history and memories to the next generation, then there is a threat that we might fail in that daily plebiscite. And then another thought that I wanted to leave before ending my presentation is, if you look at the deep history of state-making across the world, one of the strategies of the oppressed people, one of the strategies of the oppressed people is to the commitment to the memory, is through the storytelling. It is one of the most primeval things that the human beings are capable of. So once we started living together as a group, one of the first things that we did was to build fire. And then what did we do next? Is to tell stories. And this is stories that we still need to continue to tell to the younger generations. And if we wanted to succeed at questioning by questioning through this daily plebiscite, through this daily referendum, questioning the right of the People's Republic of China's rule over Tibet, then we have to transmit those memories. And then we have to remain committed to those memories. And I wanted to end, right, with the chair's permission, is to really, because once when I was preparing for this presentation, I was reading biography of Raphael Lemkin. Of course, he's a Polish lawyer who during the advent of the Nazis, he went to Sweden, and then he went to America, and he was offered a position at the Yale University, which he turned down. And he went on, he was doggedly committed to incorporate these genocide ideas, to make this as a legal tool to avoid genocides in the future. So there's this story that goes that he had to even request for money for his lunch in New York, apparently. So he has really pursued it. And another coincidence is that he was born in 1900 and he died in 1959 at the age of 1959, and exactly the same year when the national uprising in Lhasa occurred and His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to escape to India. It just makes you wonder what he would make of the Tibetan plight if he was offered the documentation of these atrocities in Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. TGSL. It was truly heartwarming and such a powerful presentation, and there will be lots of thoughts running through our audiences here who should be preparing their questions, supplementary things they want to know. Next, I would like to ask our second panel, which is Vijay Karanti. Vijay is going to talk about cultural genocide as a tool of Chinese colonization and genocide in Tibet. Since the inception in 1912, the Republic of China, modern China has been using cultural genocide as a tool to perpetuate its colonial control over all the countries it has occupied during the last century, which includes Tibet, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, East Turkestan. Vijay Karanti is an Indian journalist, has been keenly watching the Tibetan situation for the past 5 decades, and he has been a reputed photographer and daring journalist, has visited Tibet, and has been a huge and massive supporter of Tibet, as well as a third-person observer on the true aspect of the whole of India, China, and Tibet. Vijay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wish I really proved all the appreciation honestly. But anyhow, thank you very much for appreciating me for more than what I have done or what I am up to. When we talk of cultural genocide in Tibet, normally what people talk about is the massacres and otherwise human rights violations, etc. But I think that will be starting the whole story too late, from the middle of it. I would rather prefer the world to understand how this whole idea started, because this genocide of Tibetans or Tibetan culture is not something which happened either accidentally or at some stage in the history. We will have to go back. How do you change?
Just keep scrolling.
No, page down.
Yeah, just keep scrolling down. That's right.
Sorry. In my computer it works differently. We will have to go back and see what actually the People's Republic of China of today, what kind of history it had and what has resulted into whatever is happening to Tibetans, what is happening to people in East Turkestan or South Mongolia or Hong Kong people. This is not an act which has been committed at one specific place or by one specific Chinese leader. It is a running story which I would love to see that people should see the story, its beginning, and then it will be very easy to understand what China is doing either in Tibet. My idea of I'm a journalist, so I speak many times in terms which academicians would not prefer to talk like, but I talk straight. Because whatever is happening straight to the people by some forces, and why not say it in very clear words. I start with the basic issue that today's China is an artificial country. It is not what China claims. When you see today's China, I think it will be prudent to start with our recent historic memory of modern world. The China as we see today, it started actually in 1912. At that time, by that time, China was not this China. China, if you see in this map, this is although it is a schematic map, but it is very close to the real one. The Republic of China came into existence in 1912. It was Sun Yat-sen before whom China was divided. And as we saw in the previous slide, we saw that China had neighbors like Russian Empire, Tibet, East Turkestan, and China itself was divided into many, many parts. There was, if we talk There was British China, there was German China, there was French China, there was Portuguese China, and it was Sun Yat-sen who and his comrades, his colleagues, who established the Republic of China, and that was in 1912. But at that time, Manchuria was a separate nation, although its parts were occupied. Southern Mongolia was not part of China. Tibet was not part of China. And of course, Republic of East Turkestan was, it was a separate entity. But it was, the beginning of today's China started with Chiang Kai-shek. In 1919, he occupied Southern Mongolia. And that is how China expanded to this shape. And it was in 1935, Manchuria was assimilated into China. In 1946, he occupied the Republic of East Turkestan, and China expanded to this size. And it was after that that Mao came into power in 1949, and within 2 years, he occupied Tibet. And that is the real shape of People's Republic of China as the world knows it today. So we should keep in mind that China as we know it today, or China claims whatever they claim, one China policy, etc., that is an artificial nation, and it has happened in the presence of living memory of present history and historians. What I see, there is a continuity, whether it was Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, or today Xi Jinping. Whatever has happened in Manchuria, in South Mongolia, in East Turkestan, in Tibet, it is not a sin of one person. It is a continuity of the same sin, and all these 5 leaders have contributed it according to their capacities and capabilities. After Chiang Kai-shek included East Turkestan, Mao Zedong brought in Tibet into China, and after that, after occupying Tibet, Mao Zedong was a person who believed very sincerely that if all these regions which are occupied have to be ruled properly, there has to be homogeneity, there has to be uniformity, and for that, the process of cultural revolution, which also included, I will not go into details of, the homogeneity, political homogeneity he brought in, and in the process, over those 10 years and leap forward a few years before that, all that happened, and it was in that process, there is a dispute. Some people say 80 million people were killed, and my communist friends, they say, they debate, oh, this is an imperialist figure, only 30 million people were killed. Anyhow, whatever it was. So in Mao's time, there was sincere belief that if all these ethnic minorities or nationalities of these occupied nations have to be tamed, there has to be homogeneity. And his belief was, for example, on Tibet, he implemented it very strongly, that a Tibetan, he knew very well that Tibetans were deep believers in Buddhism and Dalai Lama. So he believed, his mathematics was very clear, political mathematics was, that a Tibetan minus religion, a Tibetan minus Dalai Lama is equal to a patriotic Chinese. So to produce patriotic Chinese, the faith should be knocked out. Religion should be knocked out. Faith in Dalai Lama should be knocked out. And this process was continued by later party leaders, and that process continued till 1990. in 1987, 1989, when, because of occupation, we should understand this, the colonialism which happened in Tibet, East Turkestan and South Mongolia. China had added in its present day area, 64% area belongs to these occupied countries. And the resources share, natural resources from these countries accounts for 66%, which is 2/3 of today's China's population resources. Whereas these regions contributed only 2.1% of the population. And as China claims that there are 56 nationalities in China, so today if you look at the figures, this relation between sisters is very interesting. There are 56 sisters, but all the 55 sisters put together account for less than 8% of population. The rest of all are Han Chinese. And how they have been Hanized, that's a story which tells you of the cultural genocide of all these communities, not Tibetans alone, Manchurians, South Mongolians, the Xinjiang people, or the East Turkestani people, Uyghurs and other people, and Tibetans. When Mao occupied Tibet, that was a very historic moment, especially for countries like India. I am an Indian and we understand it more than, because for our other friends, Tibet is an issue of charity. I am saying it with all due respect, because Tibetans suffered, so they deserve our sympathy, they deserve our support. And I believe this idea of support, sympathy is charity. And many countries are living without that, what you call, luxury of charity, because they don't support Tibet, they don't support East Turkestan, they support China. And for India, it's a different matter, because it changed our political fate, our defense situation, everything. The moment India-Tibet borders, which were there for centuries and thousands of years, overnight it became India-China border. So here you see yellow Tibet. When it was occupied, then China came to India's borders, and that was a master stroke. When he occupied Tibet, Tibet was a free country, as you know already. Sorry for repeating a few things, because I use this for my other audiences also. Tibet was a free country. It had its flag, it had its currency, and it had its postal system. And today's Tibet, as we see, is the new Tibet. And in new Tibet, you will see what China has done in its cultural genocide. It has affected severely the local economy, the demography, the religion of Tibet, education, language, ethnic identity, political system, even food, lifestyle, social values, the plurality of Tibetan life, and of course basic freedoms. So when I talk of cultural genocide, all these elements I include in that. And that, to me, that makes the real genocide. These are a few more slides which I don't want to go into details, but just to show you the difference what has happened. But I find the process of genocide in Tibet, cultural genocide, started with Mao's assumption that you knock out religion and faith of Tibetans in Dalai Lama and they will turn out to be patriotic Chinese. The process first started with 17-point program. There were only 4 clauses in the 17-point program, the 3rd, 4th, 7th and 9th, which dealt with the cultural personality or national personality of Tibet. The 3rd was about the local autonomy of Tibet. The 4th was for political system and Dalai Lama status. China offered that nothing will be changed. And 7th and 9th, 7th belonged to religion freedom religious freedom, customs and habits, and ninth was language education system. Why I am mentioning these four? Because China went back on all these four. All the promises which China gave, 17-point program was not drafted by Lhasa. It was drafted, written by China, and the Tibetan government or Tibetan representatives were forced to sign it. And those assurances which they gave, these four assurances, all the 17, of course they did, but these four assurances were about the national personality of China, and they have gone back. So now I come to what is happening today, in what has happened in, this is the continuity I wanted to, So we stay on this and then I'll explain. What has happened in Tibet? I divide it into certain stages. From 1951 to 1959, it was the age of promises that we will help you promote your religion, your culture, your lifestyle, your social values. And Tibetans were made to believe that China is very genuine, very helpful, very kind, it will do it. But when China failed, when went back on these promises, then there was an uprising and His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to flee from Tibet. From 1959 to 1990 is the period when Mao Zedong and his the coming leaders, successors, they religiously destroyed Tibetan religion, Tibetan culture, and all symbols which represented Tibetan national identity, whether it was monasteries, whether it was social habits. Even people were arrested and what I would say, you understand, thumbsing, people went through all social torture, even for running beads, or even making Tibetan tea in traditional way. It was a crime in all these years. But in 1987-89, when uprising happened, by that time, the leaders in Lhasa were telling Beijing everything is fine, people are very happy, Tibetans are thankful to Chairman Mao for coming and occupying Tibet, and they hate the Dalai Lama, so they are very thankful. And when it happened in 1989, then Beijing leaders started noticing that something is wrong. There was some wrong reporting. And it was at that time they gave a new thought, a review of the whole system. And from 1990, China started a new policy because when they realized people have faith in Dalai Lama, people have not lost faith in religion, and they were surprised to see that the young people whose even parents or grandparents had never seen Dalai Lama or Free Tibet, even they were they were the people who were heralding that uprising in 1989. So then they realized there is something wrong and we should do something, and that was the beginning of process of occupying religion from within. So as a part of that, the initial examples we all know, Karmapa and Panchal Lama. Their reincarnations were found, sponsored by Beijing, and the reincarnations were found. We will not go to the story of what happened to Panchal Lama and why Karmapa ran away from there. But that was the beginning, and this process continued until 2007, when China realized that the Tibetans are not an easy nut to crack. So, and the Dalai Lama's influence is not going to go away, even with generations. Then they started taking that step that the whole system should be occupied firmly from within. And when what is called Order 5 came, or the law on incarnation, when it was decided that all incarnations in Tibet of all tulkus, including Dalai Lama, Panchal Lama, etc., will not be on their own will. It will be the Communist Party of China which will decide who is the real incarnation. Practically, if you read that, it will look like if any tulku wants to be born again, before taking birth, he will have to go to Communist Party's office and get a stamp. That, please kindly permit me to be reborn. This is exactly the meaning of that, practically. So that is why China, since then, has been trying to, they have already installed many tulkus through this process. And now the process of occupying the last real place is Dalai Lama. When Xi Jinping is going mad that Dalai Lama's reincarnation is the exclusive property of China and Chinese Communist Party. So now that process is going on. To fortify that process, the education system, the religious system is being occupied. I don't want to go in those details how the language in which they had promised at one stage. Now Tibetans don't have permission to teach, let their children be taught in Tibetan language. Yeah. So I'm reaching the conclusion. So right now we are at that stage where President Xi Jinping wants to be the permanent chairman of China. I hope he has plans about his reincarnation also, because many of us we think that if a man who, a system which calls Dalai Lama all bad names for Dalai Lama, and on one hand they criticize him, they call him he is a what they call a wolf in the robes, or he is the leader of bandits, all these words. If you are so critical of Dalai Lama, why the hell you are interested in occupying the Dalai Lama's next incarnation? Or if you have really faith in reincarnation, you had wonderful leaders like Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping. So why not find their reincarnations? You will be very happy. China will be richer. But the story is very, very different. So now the process is going through different stages. Xi Jinping has announced that the Chinese Communist Youth League, 10 million volunteers, will go and spread the message of the Communist Party to all villages, which means whatever remaining signs of any culture, whether it is Uyghurs, whether it is Tibetans, whether it is Manchus, whatever they are left, or Mongols, these 10 million young people will spread over China. Will be in addition to the demographic change they have already brought in. I have traveled inside Tibet and I could have shown you some pictures, but we don't want to go to that. There are new cities which have come up where it's all Han population. And still they are not happy. Now they want to bring 10 million volunteers like Red Guards of Mao. Now these Chinese youth, Chinese Communist Party Youth League, 10 million volunteers. By end of next year, 1 million will be already spread over villages. They will teach ordinary people language, which means their language is going to be replaced through laws and through these volunteers, and only the Chinese language will be there. And if you have heard a word, terminology called love jihad, Xi Jinping is going to start a love jihad. He has already started a campaign of love jihad. Means when volunteers of Chinese Communist Youth League reach a village of Tibet or their so-called Xinjiang or South Mongolia, they are not going to take their wives and their sisters or their mothers with them. They are going to get married there. So what is going to happen? Either it will be forced marriages or promoted, where they give you huge money for internationality marriages. And this is the design of Xi Jinping. And his designs are to see the identity of Tibet, of East Turkestan, of South Mongolia, of Manchurians, and whosoever is left is coming at the end. It is a homogenized China with socialist characteristics of Xi Jinping. And this is a challenge for people like me. We claim to be democratic, we claim to be civilized. It's a challenge not for Tibetans. It's not a challenge for Uyghurs. It's not a challenge for Hong Kong people. It's not a challenge for the poor Mongolians. It's a challenge for you and me. Let's see whether we prove ourselves to be real democratic citizens of the world or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijay. It's always a pleasure to hear you, and you made in such a commitment. I know it do not justify. You came all the way from India to give a presentation, time bound by 15 minutes. I'm so sorry about that, but it was really, really wonderful. I hope we'll have additional questions which could lead to some of the things you haven't spoken yet. So next, we have today Dr. Martin Mills. In this week of COP26, Dr. Martin Mills, the Director of Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research Institute at Aberdeen University, is an instrumental person who has helped to produce the Scottish Parliament's report on climate change on the third pole, Tibet. And he is going to enlighten us how the cultural, religious, demographic, and environmental issues are all closely linked to the genocide. So here is for you, Michael. Not Michael, Martin.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sondra, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come. I am an academic, so my apologies in advance if this isn't as straight as it could be, but I will try to keep it relatively personal. I have been studying Tibet for 35 years, and this is, I think, since it's the first time I've come to Geneva, an opportunity to reflect more broadly on the kind of questions that we're looking at. But I want to start in a personal vein with a story about my grandmother. She was once teaching me when I was 10 years old to make jam. And I was trying to work out why one had to cook the fruit for so long. And she looked at me and she said, well, it's like Lenin, dear. If you have to preserve it, it had better be dead. Now, Tibetan culture is not dead. And that's a very good thing. The real question I'd like to address is to step slightly out of the legal framework and to ask why it should flourish. Because a culture in legal terms is largely a logical box. But a culture as it is lived on the ground has to have a reason. It has to have a reason for existing. The first Buddhist emperor of Tibet, Songtse Gampo, famously taught, excuse my Tibetan, Chuzang ne Samzang Lakpa. A pure intention is superior to good custom. There needs to be a reason. And I'm going to reflect on my last 35 years and tell you what I think those are, because I think it's worth saying that this is not just about museumifying a religion, about museumifying a culture, about putting it in a nice place and celebrating it once a year. It is about the power culture can have. And for that, there needs to actually be a reason in the world. Now, to give you a sense of that, as Sonamla has introduced, I'm an academic. I started 35 years ago when I first stepped foot in Lhasa as an unknowing 18-year-old, and I have been studying and researching and working on Tibet ever since, mainly on the religious side and later on the political history and state history of Tibet. More recently, I've been working as the Parliamentary Secretary for the Cross-Party Group on Tibet in Scotland. And as part of that, we got asked, well actually, we kind of drove it because we needed to look at the climate change situation in Tibet. Almost every single issue, when we looked at it, whether or not it was mass relocations on the Tibetan plateau, even whether or not it was self-immolations, all of these things seem to come back again and again to the question of climate change. And eventually we decided to bite the bullet and have a full 2-year climate change inquiry. Personally, we reviewed more than 900 scientific documents from all around the world. I can't go into detail what that report says. You can find it, it's publicly available. And actually, you guys have just produced a little book. So fast at producing things, it's wonderful. You can find my talk on YouTube, it's 35 minutes long if you hunt hard. I'll give you a substance of that though. Obviously we were looking at, for example, the dissolution of the majority of Tibet's glacial mass by the year 2100 at the latest, because there are many processes we still don't understand, and things are, as you've noticed, going faster than scientists expected. The dissolution of its underlying permafrost. Both of those added together create really major shifts in the freshwater distribution of the Tibetan plateau. And that fresh water is what feeds the 10 major rivers of Asia, from the Irrawaddy and the Yangtze and the Yarlung Tsangpo and the Brahmaputra, which is the Yarlung Tsangpo, the Indus, the Sutlej, the Ganges. All of these are fed from that Tibetan plateau, and all of them depend on its fresh water, because you can't drink fresh water, you can't drink salt water, you can't put it in a machine, and you can't put it on your fields. If we're not getting fresh water off the Tibetan plateau year-round, then effectively large slabs of Asia's human carrying capacity disappears. And we know that almost certainly, without doubt, that will happen this century. As you can imagine, we needed to understand the drivers for that. And I think this is important because the cultural question and the environmental question go together. There are actually 3 layers of drivers, and here I'm going to be a little off message. There are 3 things that drive the Tibetan plateau, that drive climate change on the Tibetan plateau, or more to point 3 levels. If we look at the local level, it is certainly things like urbanization, infrastructure growth, transport structure growth, and mining. Those 4, okay? Those are creating hot spots across the Tibetan plateau that are generating general layers of heat, as they do in almost any urban center around the world. If we look at more regionally, the primary drivers actually come off the Indian subcontinent. Those are brown and black carbon depositions, because the winds flow that way. Okay, and that's what lands on a glacier. And when black soot lands on a glacier, it's like putting on a dark coat on a hot day. You get hot. And that's what leads to that kind of melting. But at a global level, the drivers are primarily CO2 production and water vapor. Those 2 things are the major greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. CO2, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. And those, I have to say, they don't care about our borders. They move around the entire troposphere, and they move at great speed. So they're coming kind of from everywhere. I appreciate, in this regard, China produces 27% of the carbon dioxide of the human race. Okay, actually more if you include the Belt and Road material. But nonetheless, let's be clear about something here. China can create, but it cannot control the vast majority of climate change drivers on the Tibetan plateau. It is beyond its control, even if many of them are being created by it. And that is a great puzzle for climate change policymakers. Now, I mention this because, one, the impact of climate change around the world is so great and so urgent, and I cannot speak of how urgent it is that this is dealt with right now and is dealt with in a really coherent way. This is certainly the single greatest issue of our time, and it overshoots all questions, and I'm sorry to say this, it overshoots all questions about democracy, about self-determination, about all of these things. You can't self-determine if you're dead. Sorry, but it's simply true. So this thing needs to be looked at very, very urgently. Second is that cultural genocide in Tibet, which is real, shares many of the same features as I've just outlined for climate change, because to my view, after years of looking at this, after 35 years of studying this matter, the two share the same root. Now, tell us what that nature of that root is. Okay, firstly, again, this is very much a historical question. How many people in the room have read the Communist Manifesto at some point in their life? You're all terrible, all right? You should read these things, even if you don't agree with them, all right? So that's your first task. At least read this thing, because in one at least crucial regard, it is shown to be emphatically historically wrong. As you probably know, since I'll have to tell you now, because none of you have read it, as you probably know, Marxism, since the days of the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte and the Communist Manifesto and all of those things, because I have read my Marx, argued that history went through several stages. Feudalism would give way to capitalism. Capitalism would inevitably give way to either socialism or to communism. This has always presented a major problem for historians, because it simply never happened that way. Every major communist revolution that has happened in human history occurred in feudal societies and then gave way to capitalism. Okay? Now that's an important fact, because we see it again and again. We see it in Russia, we see it in South America, we see it in China. All of the features point towards the fact that actually, despite the claims made in the Communist Manifesto, the claims that capitalism would give way to communism, and therefore the whole thing that almost intellectually created the Cold War, within which the Tibetan cause was born, that whole thing appears to be sort of historically simply wrong. That communism looks like a transitional phase towards capitalism. A transitional phase, however, that creates a capitalist economy in the long run, but in a kind of different way. It's almost like a late international version that has to springboard it through, as Mao said, through strong state control. And here's the real difference, in this sense, that there is certainly a difference between capitalism and communism. Don't think I'm arguing that. The difference is primarily this. Firstly, historically, all of the major changes that we have seen in China and Tibet and Russia and Siberia and all of those places that were wrought by communist societies, all of those, whether or not you're talking about mass land ownership to redistribution, mass industrialization, dissolution of other cultures as effective political and social actors, widespread introduction of cash crops and economies, near total, well, we've done land distribution, dissolution of social groups out with monetarized or state control exchanges. All of those changes are equally present in capitalist societies. The difference is the degree of control and freedom that is involved in making those self-same processes happen. To all intents and purposes, and I will summarize it here because I'll be as quick as I can. To all intents and purposes, let me put it like this. What communism achieved in 100 years with the stick, capitalism achieved in 300 years with the carrot. Communism asserts central state control to achieve the same goals. Historically, we've seen all of that. Whereas capitalism manufactures desire. Both of those philosophies, and here I would argue is the root, both of those philosophies both of those systems share one root philosophy. They are almost entirely exclusively materialist. When I say exclusively materialist, let me tell you what I mean by that. I mean that The exclusive materialism is the view that all human meaning and satisfaction can and must be found within the acquisition and management of material resources. I'll say that again, because it's the point where my students start scribbling. That is the view that all human meaning and satisfaction can and must be found within the acquisition and management of material resources. That is, therefore, economy.
Yes.
Okay? And that is true whether or not you're talking about the United States of America or you're talking about China, or even if you're talking about China during the Great Leap Forward, the same principle applies. Now, let me be really clear about this, because this is true across the board. Whether or not you're talking about communism and capitalism in those regards, and with those two separate timescales, and those two separate mechanisms of coercion and attraction, individual little choices over here about things that get you a better job, a higher standard of living, the things you want, the television you want to buy, all of those little things, nonetheless produce the same ultimate results. That is, as we have seen, 1, the destabilization of Earth's climate. 2, the wholesale destruction of other species. Let me be clear about how bad that has got. 96% of the mammals on Earth are now domesticated. 96% of the mammals on Earth are now part of our economic system. The other 4% are the rest of wildlife. Okay? That's how far we've gone down that road without any of us really paying very much attention. The third one is this, is the wholesale dissolution of other cultures, most particularly those that question that question of exclusive materialism. Now, the problem with it is we have reached almost the edge of that. We've reached almost the edge of that philosophy. To all intents and purposes, when it comes to the question of climate change, the one thing we found in our 2 years of looking at these papers was that our political leaders and policymakers, when it comes to really answering the question, do not know what to do. It's not that they're dragging their heels. It's not that they're making a lot, they're making a lot of hot air because they don't know. But the truth of the matter is, having drawn most people's human attention towards exclusive materialism for nearly 150 straight years, they don't know how to turn the population around, because you can add as many technical material fixes as you like. You can put in your solar power cells and your ground source heat pumps, and you can change to an electric car and everything on those, but none of that will change the fact that each of us desire too much. Now, in this regard, I will therefore finish, not too quickly, by asking a question. Is it too much, therefore? And I'm an academic and I'm a scientist, okay? But is it too much to ask whether at this point in our human life, when we have reached the logical end of the road to a certain extent, whether something like Tibetan Buddhism, whether the range of non-materialistic thought processes that the human race has seek to produce as wisdom throughout its history could be taken as more than simply an exotic sideshow that needs to be, at this point in time, fiercely introduced into the public debate. The Dalai Lama, His Holiness, has been trying to do this for 60 years. And often he's kind of on his own. And we need to be kind of stronger than that, all right? Because this is not a sideshow anymore. It really is. We've either got to come up with solutions of this, and the technical fixes won't do the job, or we're done for. And we're probably done for anyway, by the way, just in case. But there we go. Now, I'm certainly not advocating that everyone become a Buddhist, nor am I advocating that they give up on materialism. A full human being is both material and personal. They have both of those things. Our brains actually are wired to think in both those ways. But we do not have the cultural and intellectual resources available to us now. And that can only be found in the cultures that we have sought, between communism and capitalism both, to completely sideline and put in little museums and say how wonderful they are. And as I say, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been saying this for 60 years, and he was, as he always is, quite right.
Thank you very much, Martin. Always wonderful to hear you, and somewhat pessimistic, but never mind, that's the reality. Now, I think I have been very generous with the time with the speaker, but we started late, so I'm sure that organizers will have some leeway for us. I would like to invite my last speaker, Mr. Donnet, and this will be a continuation of what Martin has started, the culture genocide on towards our environmental degradation, and Pierre will discuss the problems created by China. He has seen this with his own eyes in his life in there. So let me not waste time, and I will invite Mr. Donnet here.
Thank you very much. Actually, I see my watch. I have 10 minutes left.
You have 5 minutes more.
5 minutes more?
Yes.
7 minutes? In any case, I'm very honored to be here today. It's a great day for me. I feel like here, like in my own family. I met again with old friends that I haven't seen for more than 40 years. I met new friends, and it's very challenging for me. Honorable C.K. Pan Mark-Selin this morning gave a speech which was really enlightening. Actually, I'm a bit more optimistic than he is. I will tell you more later on that. I was a reporter. I'm not an academic. I'm not a scientific. I'm a reporter. So makes me in a difficult position because usually my job is to ask questions and to listen to the answers. So now it's just the opposite. So I'm not very talented in that. This is why I took notes. I was based in Beijing between 1984 to 1989. During these 6 years, I experienced various testimonies. I met a lot of people. At that time, there was a little more freedom than now, so I could meet Chinese people, could discuss with them their opinions, and that was very interesting for me. And in August 1985, I traveled to Tibet, and I stayed there with my wife, who is there, for about 2 weeks. And during these 2 weeks, it was the first time the Chinese authorities allowed foreign people to travel in Tibet without a guide. So we were not on our own. We could meet anybody we would meet without surveillance. So this is, of course, not possible now. And during these 2 weeks, I met with Tibetan people, especially Tibetan monks, who told me their sufferings in Chinese language. Why in Chinese language? I don't speak Tibetan, I just know a few words, like Gyami, which means Chinese. So they talk to me in Chinese because they learn Chinese in Chinese jail in Tibet. So, as you mentioned, to tell that story, this is exactly what is the task of the journalist. To tell the story so that other people know what's happening. So when I got back to Beijing from Lhasa, I wrote stories about what I heard from the Tibetan people. And when the Chinese authorities read my stories, I was summoned to the Foreign Ministry Information Department, and they told me, Mr. Donnet, you will never go back to Tibet. You have to forget it. So in fact, I never went back to Tibet, but I went to Kham and Amdo. I was still able to go there. So I met Tibetan people there, so I could continue my story. And when I go back to Paris in 1989, I decided to write a book. Because to write a book is also a way to tell people what's happening there. So that book was published in French, and also in English, and also in Japanese, and also in Chinese. Of course, published in Taiwan. So in non-simplified characters. So it's difficult for Chinese people in mainland China to read it. But anyway. So you mentioned the Great Leap Forward. Actually, millions of people died of hunger in Tibet and other regions, but the Great Leap Forward, actually, more than 40 million people died of hunger in China. And there were scenes of cannibalism, young people eating their parents' dead corpse. So my colleague at that time in Beijing, Jasper Becker, wrote a book. The title is The Hungry Ghosts. That book also exists in French language. But turning back to Xi Jinping, you were talking about his reincarnation, if even one day he reincarnates. I think he could reincarnate, he reincarnates into a stray dog. A stray dog, I think this is what actually he is. He wants to control everything. But at the end, I think one day he will control nothing. And also, I would like to make a difference between the Chinese people and the Chinese communist regime. This is two different things.
Yes.
So, I talk about the Chinese communist regime. So we all know what are the sufferings of the Tibetan. That began in October 1950 when 80,000 Chinese soldiers invaded Tibet. A crusade that the Chinese invaders presented as a peaceful liberation of Tibet, following ardent requests from Tibetans who supposedly wanted the Chinese help to be freed from slavery. This, of course, is totally wrong. Tibet invasion was the result of Mao Zedong's desire to expand the Chinese territory. Since that date, Tibet's situation has grown from bad to worse, with each day passing. During the sinister Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, thousands of Tibetan monks were arrested, tortured, killed, when they were not just sent to prisons or labor camps. Monasteries were ravaged, torched, looted, or often simply destroyed. We exchanged ideas over the lunch, and we talked about the big Ganden monastery, about 100 kilometers from Lhasa. That monastery was destroyed so much that today only a few bricks and pieces of wood remain. Tibetan cultural artifacts, jewels, and other precious parts of the Tibetan culture disappeared and were taken to Beijing. Some of this treasure was later retrieved and transported back to Tibet. Former Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai had some role in protecting Tibetan treasure stored in the Beijing Forbidden City from the young crazy Red Guards. After the end of the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese regime permitted the monasteries and temples to be rebuilt and the Tibetan religion to be observed again. Nevertheless, Tibetan suffering looks endless. Tibetan language, that was said before me, is slowly disappearing. Religious activities are strictly controlled. Pictures of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, are forbidden in Tibetan homes. Contacts with overseas Tibetans are almost impossible. this is also we discussed over the lunch, negotiations between the Chinese government and the Tibetan government in exile have been interrupted by Beijing long ago. What's the situation today? The Chinese regime only waits for the death of the Dalai Lama. When that date arrives, Beijing would impose a new so-called Dalai Lama, which would be, of course, totally under its control. Now comes the question, is Tibet going to survive? Today, the same is happening in Xinjiang, actually, eastern Turkestan. The Chinese regime has adopted the same means to suppress the Uyghurs, to erase the Uyghur identity once for all. In fact, Tibet has been the laboratory of what is now happening in eastern Turkestan, so-called Xinjiang. Now, the Chinese regime has not been so harsh all the time. I just talked about Chuanai roles in protecting the Tibetan cultural artifacts. But Mr. Hu Yaobang, when he visited Tibet in 1987, he weeps, he cried, and he said, "This is what you did for Tibet. That is shameful. You should be ashamed." And to talk about Mr. Xi Jinping again, his father, Mr. Xi Zhongxun, who actually was a comrade of Mao Zedong during the Long March, he had some tenderness for the Dalai Lama when they met in Beijing. And the Dalai Lama was very young, offered Mr. Xi Zhongxun an Omega watch. And Xi Zhongxun kept the watch on his wrist until he died. So, indeed, there is a cultural genocide happening in Tibet. For me, it was difficult to measure the fact, is it a genocide or not? But studying what's happening, there is one marker which shows that this is a full-blown genocide. I mean sterilizations, forced sterilizations. That happened for the Tibetan woman, and this is now happening for the Uyghur women and other Muslim minorities in eastern Turkestan. Now, let me talk briefly about environment in China and Tibet. Here, I totally agree with you. I think this is the urgent, the moment of truth for the whole mankind. There is no time to lose. We have lost time too much. This is the time to decide about how we will forge the future. If we don't do that, we are going to be dead. Not you, not me, but our sons, daughters, grandsons, and granddaughters. Deforestation is a huge problem for China and the world. More than half of the forests in the world, billion trees, are being cut each year, mostly in tropical zones. China alone has undergone a massive deforestation drive for 40 years, resulting from massive industrialization as well as progresses of urban zones. But here are also massive illegal cuts of trees, especially in Tibet. Deforestation continues. According to the NGO Global Forest Watch, between 2002 and 2019, China has lost 74,900 hectares of humid forest. During the same period, primary forest has been reduced by 4.3%. From 2001 to 2019, China has lost 9.92 million hectares of vegetal covering, thus reducing 6.1% of vegetal covering each year since the year 2000. China's cartography presents a persistent and fast deforestation on coastal zone, this because of urbanization in the regions where the economic growth is the fastest in China. We must also realize that China has become a terrifying predator with regard to induced deforestation in a number of developing countries, mostly in Southeast Asia and Africa, where millions of trees are cut to satisfy voracious needs of China in wood, including rare essences which are threatened of rapid and total extinction. In Laos, for instance, forests covered 2/3 of the territory in the 90s. Nowadays, it represents less than 40% of the territory. In Cambodia, the situation is even far worse. In this country, deforestation has been the highest in the world, 14.4% between 2001 and 2014. This process of deforestation benefits China, but has devastating consequences for the environment and for the ethnic minorities living in those areas. The nightmare is also present, of course, in Indonesia, where forests are cut to make room for olive palm plantations. In Africa, China is playing a central role in the deforestation, which has been denounced by the United Nations Organization for Food and Agriculture. Chinese pollution is also obvious on its soils, rivers, and other waterways. Taking the example of the famous Yangtze River, the Changjiang in Chinese, the longest one in China and the third longest in the world after the Amazon and the Nile. It is the most endangered one. The Yangtze River provides 1/3 of China's water, but also absorbs more than 40% of China's used waters. Overexploited, covered by numerous dams. We talked about the dams just before. It represents 3/5 of China's hydroelectric reserves. But the Yangtze River has been suffering from sand excavation in the past decade. Now, let's talk about the Yellow River, considered as the cradle of the Chinese civilization. It is the 6th biggest river in the world, but it has dried up several times since 1972, for periods more and more long, for up to 3 months in winter seasons.
Put it in a nutshell.
So, why is the Chinese regime so keen about Tibet? One of the reasons is that Tibet has huge reserves of copper, lithium, gold, and silver. Most of it has never been touched because the Tibetans didn't mine the land. It's against their religious practices to disturb the ground. But China has begun mining on an enormous scale. Another aspect of China's colonization of Tibet is the constructions of huge dams. China has more dams than the rest of the world put together, so they are gradually working in their way towards the Tibetan plateau. And we are not talking about small dams, we are talking about mega dams. China says that they need the dams for industry and the military. But they are also essential for mining, which has taken off on a very large scale. Mining used in a small operation like gold miners, individual small groups, and then along came the railway, which is basically from Xining to Lhasa. That railway enabled cheap labor to come in, and it also enables exploitation of minors for the first time in Tibet history. To conclude this talk, I would like to say that one day Tibet maybe will stay alive. Why that? It will be maybe one day free again. Why that? One day, maybe sooner than many think, truth will prevail. One day the world will realize that Tibet's cultural heritage is a precious jewel for all of us.
Due to time
Very good
constraint,
insight.
I have to apologize to everybody that we will have no opportunity for question and answer. I hope I've given ample time for our panels to say everything they wanted to say, but I'm very sorry we have run out of time, and I have to stop our panel here. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Geneva Forum organizing team, may I request Secretary Kamachila to kindly present Tibetan Traditional Staff Kata and the book Tibet Brief 2020 to all the panelists and chairperson for this very insightful panel. Thank you so much.
For me too.
You're still here.
Your experience is really a good reason to be jealous here. But a good reason.
Thank you.
We are praying. And after that, we will have the special panel on Tibet stolen child, the 11th Panchen Lama Devi Chief.
I wanted to note down the
I
name of your book.
sincerely request everyone to get
The last
back
book,
to the
right?
conference
My latest book.
at